Some people bring sad little Tupperware lunches because they don't understand how real professionals operate. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. St. Michael's ICU in Houston hums with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of bleach mixed with something older, fear, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of people fighting against their own mortality. Margaret Walsh moves through it like a shadow, folding linens with hands that never tremble despite the scars crossing her knuckles. The white cotton folds into thirds. Thirds again. Her movements are efficient, practiced, the kind of precision that comes from doing something 10,000 times. She's been here 3 years now, quiet and competent. The nurse other staff barely notice except when her patient charts are too detailed, too meticulous, when her notes somehow find the problems everyone else missed. The fluorescent panels above her flicker in their systematic way, a hum that most people stop hearing after the first week. Margaret never stops hearing it. Her jaw is tight. Her breathing is controlled. Around her, the ICU moves in its organized chaos, monitors beeping their rhythmic warnings, nurses calling out lab values, doctors moving between rooms like men playing chess with lives. Nobody looks at Margaret. Nobody ever does. 3 years of perfect work, 0 complaints, 0 incidents, and somehow she had become invisible. It wasn't intentional. It was strategic. Invisibility was a survival skill she had perfected in a place called Tikrit, where being seen meant being targeted, and staying alive meant becoming part of the background. The linen cart moves smoothly. She knows the weight distribution of every item. Muscle memory. Not from linens. From other things. Things the government had decided never happened. In her locker behind the spare scrub sits a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked at the ankles from desert heat and repeated movement. Dirt from Tikrit is still embedded in the treads, actual soil from a place that doesn't officially appear in her service record anymore. The boots are a risk. Every time she reaches past them, she feels the weight of keeping them hidden. But she needs to know they're there. She needs to know that Margaret Walsh who folded linens in a Houston hospital was the same Margaret Walsh who once carried a 6'2" Marine through 11 miles of desert heat after the IED took his legs. The memory lives in her shoulders now. In her hands. In the way she moves through the world with a kind of terrible certainty about what violence looks like. She places another folded sheet on the stack. White cotton. Sterile. Simple. Dr. Caldwell is at the vending machine when Margaret carries fresh linens toward the supply room. She knows this because the hallway goes quiet in a specific way when he's present, that particular silence that happens when people are simultaneously trying to work and trying not to be noticed. He's wearing his white coat over a shirt that probably costs more than Margaret makes in 2 weeks. His Rolex catches the fluorescent light. When he sees her approaching with her cart of linens and her thermos of coffee and her small plastic container holding exactly what he's about to mock, something shifts in his expression. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to contempt. The kind of contempt that comes from recognizing someone who won't fight back. He's inserting a bill into the machine, a $100 bill, which seems excessive for a coffee that costs $3. The bill gets stuck. He punches the machine twice, hard. It's not a violent gesture. It's entitlement that has never learned the word no. Margaret doesn't stop walking. She never stops. Stopping would be acknowledging him. Stopping would be making this real. She keeps moving, and that's when he speaks, his voice carrying easily down the hallway because he knows no one will tell him to lower it. You know what separates the professionals from the clock watchers? His voice is like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, mechanical, deliberately loud. Margaret doesn't turn. She doesn't slow. It's understanding that this isn't some 9-to-5 operation. Real professionals understand that nutrition is something you manage while you're actually working. That's why I order in. He gestures at the vending machine, at his failed attempt to extract overpriced coffee. Real professionals don't show up with sad little Tupperware lunches like they're in elementary school. That's just transparent. That's just announcing to everyone that you don't understand how the world actually works. Margaret's hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. Her jaw tightens by maybe 0.5 millimeter, something only visible if someone was looking for it. Which he is. He's waiting for something, a flinch, a response, a moment where she acknowledges his superiority by defending herself. She doesn't give it to him. Instead, she rounds the corner into the supply room and places the linens on the shelf with the same careful precision she's been using for 3 years. The fluorescent lights hum. She can hear him still talking to someone else out there, explaining his philosophy on professional standards, on what separates the serious people from the mediocre ones. The words pass through her like wind through a chain-link fence. She's heard worse. She survived worse. The patient in bed 12 isn't the worst case in the ICU, but he's close. His medical chart reads like a tragedy written in medical abbreviations: severe traumatic brain injury, post-anoxic encephalopathy, Glasgow coma scale of 6. The IED had taken his legs and scrambled everything in his skull that makes a person who they are. When Margaret checks his vitals, she moves with the same quiet efficiency she uses everywhere else, 2 fingers on his wrist, watching his chest rise and fall, noting the way his pupils don't track her movement. The ventilator beside his bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm. In out. In out. The machine breathing for him because his own brain has forgotten how to tell his lungs to work. The monitors show stable vital signs. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Heart rate steady at 86 beats per minute. Everything measurable is acceptable. Everything that matters is gone. She's smoothing his sheets, unnecessary task, but she does it anyway when she notices the tattoo on his forearm. It's faded, done years ago, the ink blurred slightly from sun exposure and time. The letters are block style, military precise, M. Walsh. Her hand stops. Just for a moment. Just long enough that if someone had been watching, they would have seen something shift in her face. But nobody is watching. Nobody ever watches her. She finishes smoothing the sheet. She checks the fall line. She adjusts the monitor leads. Her face is completely neutral. Her breathing is completely controlled. She is a nurse in a hospital checking vitals on a patient. That's all she is. That's all anyone here knows her to be. But the tattoo sits on her skin like a question mark. M for what? How many men had she known with M names? How many had they worked with in the desert? She pushes the thought away. That person doesn't exist anymore. The government had made that official. The redacted files, the erased records, the carefully constructed disappearance, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had been terminated with prejudice, her service declared classified at a level that made her own existence questionable. She was nothing now. She was a woman folding linens in Houston, bringing sad little Tupperware lunches that some man in an expensive watch was using as evidence of her professional inadequacy. She had made peace with that trade. She had to. The alternative was living publicly as someone the Pentagon had decided was too dangerous to acknowledge. She leaves his room and moves toward her locker at the end of the supply corridor. The hallway is empty at this hour, 4:47 p.m., that space between the day shift finishing and the night shift arriving when the hospital holds its breath. She opens her locker. The spare scrubs are folded neatly on the upper shelf, arranged exactly how she arranged them. Below them, hidden behind the blue fabric, are the boots. She reaches past them without pulling them out. She just needs to know they're there. She just needs to feel that they exist. The leather is rough under her fingertips. The soles are worn flat in specific places from how she walks. The heels are compressed from how she stands, weight distributed, ready to move, never caught off balance. Everything about those boots tells the story of someone who has survived things that would break most people. She closes the locker. The metal door clicks shut with a sound like a weapon being cleared. Tomorrow she'll fold more linens. Tomorrow Dr. Caldwell will make more observations about her professional inadequacy. Tomorrow the patient in bed 12 will lie in the hospital bed with his M. Walsh tattoo and his shattered brain, staring at nothing, remembering nothing. And Margaret Walsh will move through it all like a ghost, because that's what she had become. A ghost of someone who used to be real. A shadow of a woman who once carried a bleeding Marine 11 miles through a desert that tried to kill her every single step. The room went quiet. The next voice she heard would change everything. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant song above bed 7. 20 staff members circled the bed during grand rounds like vultures shifting on a thermal current, their white coats and stethoscopes creating a flock of authority that Margaret moved quietly through, checking the patients for line with hands that had learned to be invisible. Dr. Caldwell held up her patient chart like evidence of a crime. His fingers gripped the edges of the clipboard the way a prosecutor grips a weapon, precise, theatrical, designed to wound without touching. "This is what inefficient documentation looks like, people," he announced, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man accustomed to an audience. "Nurse Walsh here believes we have unlimited time to write novels about every bowel movement and vital sign change. Look at this, 4 separate entries for one patient in a 6-hour window. This costs the hospital money. This is why we can't compete with Methodist Houston. This is why your departments don't get funding." Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly. A muscle beneath her left temple flexed once, then stilled. Her hands remained steady as she continued marking vitals on her own chart, each notation precise, meticulous, unhurried. She could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, some sympathetic, most just grateful it wasn't their work being shredded in public. The resident from pulmonology stared at his feet. The cardiac fellow suddenly became very interested in the monitor display. No one defended her. No one spoke. Caldwell flipped through 3 more pages, his eyebrows raising with each sheet as if encountering evidence of incompetence so profound it astonished even him. Temperature checks at 08:30, 09:15, and 09:45. That's 3 separate notifications to the attending. "Margaret, did you think this patient was going to spontaneously develop a fever? Or were you perhaps, and I'm just thinking out loud here, covering yourself because you don't trust the medical team around you?" He smiled. The kind of smile that predators wear. That's paranoia masquerading as diligence. And paranoia is expensive. He snapped the chart shut and handed it back to Margaret with a gesture that was almost contemptuous. "Next time, consolidate. Trust your team. Document less. Cost the hospital less." Margaret accepted the clipboard. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, flat, unreadable, the eyes of someone whose mind was already somewhere else. Then she turned and walked back to the medication cart, moving with the kind of steady calm that only comes from having already survived worse things than this. The group dispersed. Grand rounds continued at the next bed. By 2 p.m., Margaret had already forgotten most of what Caldwell said, the words sliding off her like rain off a wax jacket. What she couldn't forget was what she saw 2 days later. She was rounding on the patient in bed 3 when she noticed Caldwell with a woman in a tailored blazer and a Rolex that probably cost more than Margaret's annual salary. The woman was sitting up in bed, looking nervous, and Caldwell was speaking in the soft, gentle voice he reserved for people with money. "Your imaging is actually quite concerning," he was saying, leaning against the bed rail with the casual confidence of a man who'd said this 1,000 times. "Those nodules we found on your CT scan, they could be nothing. But in cases like yours, I always recommend a PET scan followed by an MRI with contrast. Call it defensive medicine, but I've seen too many people miss early indicators. We schedule that today, you've got results by Friday." The woman's face had paled. She nodded quickly, ready to agree to anything that promised safety. Margaret saw the chart later. The concerning nodules the radiologist had noted as stable, benign calcifications, no follow-up needed. She saw the billing codes Caldwell had attached to the PET scan order, codes that matched procedures worth $18,000, procedures that would be categorized as medically necessary and covered by insurance. She saw the pattern when she looked at his admissions from the previous month, wealthy patients, vague findings, expensive cascading workups, each one generating revenue that somehow flowed through a consulting company registered to Caldwell's brother-in-law at an address in the Cayman Islands. The hospital administrator made $240,000 a year. The chief of medicine made $380,000. Dr. Caldwell made $420,000 in official salary, but the consulting fees were approaching $500,000 annually. It was all legal. It was all billable. It was all precisely calculated to exist in the spaces between regulation and fraud, in that grey zone where greed and medicine intersected like runways at an airport. Margaret didn't report it. Not yet. She simply documented everything, filing notes away in a mind trained to observe, retain, and act on intelligence when the moment came. That moment came 3 days later at the nurse's station. She was retrieving a medication when Caldwell approached, and he was in that particular mood, the one that meant he'd had a successful morning of unnecessary procedures and was feeling magnanimous in the way that only money could make a person feel. "There she is. Tupperware Walsh," he said, leaning against the counter close enough that she could smell his cologne and his coffee breath, a particular brand of dental neglect that money apparently couldn't fix. "You know, some of us actually eat like professionals, Margaret. There's a restaurant in Montrose. Beautiful wine list. Fresh fish flown in from the Gulf daily. But I suppose when you're documenting bedpan schedules all day, you don't have energy for real dining." 3 nurses within earshot suddenly became fascinated with their computer screens. The monitor in front of one of them displayed nothing but a blank desktop screen, yet she stared at it with the intensity of someone reading classified documents. Margaret closed her locker door. Her hand was steady on the handle. The Tupperware containers inside had been packed at 6 a.m. in her small apartment: chicken breast, steamed broccoli, brown rice. 42 grams of protein, 23 grams of carbohydrates, measured and tracked with the same precision she brought to her charting. Fuel. Nothing more. She'd eaten the same meal for 6 years, maybe longer. She honestly couldn't remember. "Do you need something, doctor?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly neutral. The kind of voice you use to order food or read a medication list. No edge. No sting. Just words. Caldwell's smile tightened slightly, barely perceptible, but Margaret caught it. He'd wanted a reaction. Anger, defensiveness, something he could work with. Instead, he got a nurse asking a clarifying question as if his existence was merely a logistical matter requiring solution. "Just making conversation," he said, and the edge that had disappeared returned. "Although now that you mention it, I heard you questioning my dosage calculation for bed 12 yesterday. The brain-damaged kid with the tattoo. Something about it being too aggressive." Margaret's jaw became granite. "You question my treatment protocols again, Margaret, and I'll have security escort you out of this building personally. You understand? You're a nurse. A competent one, I'll grant you, but fundamentally a nurse. I'm a physician. I have 32 years of medical training and board certification in 3 specialties. I don't need validation from the charting department. You do your job. I'll do mine. Know your place." Her hands, those hands that had performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest cavity in a sandstorm outside Tikrit, hands that had worked a beating heart back to rhythm while the world exploded around her, went white around the edges of her coffee mug. 2 seconds passed. 3. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's monitor beeped in the distance. "Understood, Doctor," Margaret said. And she walked away, her spine straight, her footfalls measured against the tile floor. 1 step, 2, 3, for toward the patient rooms. The knuckles of her right hand remained white for the entire walk. That night, alone in the supply closet at 11:06 p.m., restocking for bags into the metal shelves with a kind of mechanical precision that helped her think, her hands trembled for approximately 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Her breath came a little faster, her jaw clenched so tightly she thought her teeth might crack, and something that tasted like sand and blood from 2 decades past rose up in her throat like bile. Then she set down the 4 bags she was holding. Then she breathed. Then her hands went still again. She finished the restocking. She checked the medication cart. She walked back to the nurse's station and clocked out at 12:48 a.m., and if anyone had been watching closely, really watching, they might have noticed that the tremor was gone, that her movements had shifted from the careful, controlled precision of someone managing rage to something different entirely. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm passes. The kind of calm that precedes action. But that was the worst part of all. The calmness. The absolute absence of visible consequence to Caldwell's cruelty meant he would continue. It meant other nurses would hear about it and wonder if speaking up was worth the career risk. It meant the unnecessary procedures would continue. It meant that somewhere down the line, someone would get hurt not by incompetence but by the simple greed of a man who'd confused his salary with his skill. Margaret Walsh had learned a long time ago that the world didn't reward people for staying quiet. It rewarded them for knowing when to stop being quiet. But that moment hadn't come yet. The moment came at 2:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the ICU doors exploded inward and everything changed. At 2:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, the ICU doors exploded inward. A man stood in the threshold. 250 pounds of muscle and rage wrapped in a tattered grey hoodie. His head was shaved, scarred from temple to jaw in a pattern Margaret recognized, old shrapnel wounds from Tikrit. His hands trembled as he raised a piece of broken rebar, rust flaking from the twisted metal like dried blood. He screamed in Arabic. Not words. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than language. A sound that meant loss. That meant fury. That meant a man had nothing left to break except the world in front of him. The ICU fractured. A resident dropped his tablet. It clattered against the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot. Nurses abandoned monitors mid-scan. The respiratory therapist backing away from the ventilator bay didn't even close the cabinet. A medical student pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, breath coming in short panic gasps. They moved like prey animals who'd caught the scent of a predator, not running yet, but coiled, ready to bolt. The man swung the rebar in a wide arc. It cut through the air with a hiss that made 3 people flinch. Dr. Caldwell stood near the central station, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. For exactly 2 seconds, his face registered nothing. Then survival instinct took over. He turned and walked, not ran, walked with the measured pace of someone pretending this wasn't happening, toward his office. His door closed with a soft click. The lock engaged. Through the frosted glass, Margaret could see his silhouette lower itself into his leather chair. Everyone else moved toward the exit. The charge nurse was already at the side door, holding it open, gesturing frantically. Go, go, go. A cardiologist squeezed past her. 2 nurses from the night shift who'd stayed late for report. The security guard at the front desk was on his radio, voice tight. We have a threat in ICU, male, approximately 250 pounds, armed with metal object, requesting immediate response. The young man in bed 12 started to seize. His monitor went haywire, heart rate spiking, oxygen saturation dropping. Alarms shrieked in overlapping frequencies, a chorus of machines screaming warnings into the chaos. Margaret didn't move toward the exits. She moved toward the man. Her hands were steady as she walked. Her breathing was level. The way she carried her weight, balanced on the balls of her feet, shoulders loose, spine aligned, didn't match the terrified nurse everyone thought she was. This was the walk of someone who'd cleared buildings in Anbar province. Someone who'd felt bullets move through the air close enough to displace her hair. Someone who understood that panic was a choice, and fear was just information. She spoke in Arabic. Slow. Calm. The accent of someone from deep in the Levantine regions, a dialect she'd learned from a team member in Tikrit whose family was from Damascus. Brother. Brother, I see you. The man's attention swiveled toward her voice like a gun turret finding a target. The rebar dropped slightly. Not lowered. Dropped. The muscles in his arm were shaking with the weight of rage. Margaret took another step forward. Her voice didn't change pitch or speed. I see your pain. I see it clearly. He began screaming again. Words this time. Broken, jagged words about a hospital. About a brother. About an American who'd been brought here with shrapnel in his brain and left to die while the doctors made phone calls about money. Margaret understood every word. She kept moving toward him, unhurried, hands visible and open. Your brother was here. In this place. My brother died here. His voice cracked like old leather. They let him die. I know. Margaret was 5 feet away now. Close enough to see the whites of his eyes, the way sweat dripped down his scarred temple, the tremor in his grip on the rebar. I'm sorry for your loss. He raised the metal bar again. You're sorry? No. Margaret's voice dropped an octave. Became something different. Something that made the remaining staff members freeze mid-escape. Sorry is empty. But I can help you understand what happened to him. And you're going to let me. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The man's arm shook. His breathing was ragged, forced. He was 2 seconds from swinging, from striking out at the first thing within reach, which would be her. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. His jaw was clenched so hard Margaret could hear his teeth grinding from where she stood. Lower the bar, Margaret said. Just to your side. Just move it down. Why should I listen to? Because you recognize me. She stepped closer. One more pace. Close enough that if he swung now, she'd be inside the arc of the blow. Close enough that she could move. His eyes changed. Recognition flickered behind the rage, like a light switching on in a dark building. She watched him process her face. The way she moved. The way she spoke his language without an American accent twisting it into something unrecognizable. You were there, he whispered. In Tikrit. The one with. Margaret moved. Her left hand came up and under his wrist, breaking his grip on the rebar with pressure applied exactly at the radial ulnar joint. No joint dislocation. No broken bones. No bruises. Just precise mechanical advantage, the kind that came from having trained it 10,000 times against opponents who were faster and stronger. The bar fell from his fingers. She caught it one-handed and set it against the wall without looking away from him. Her right hand found the pressure point on his shoulder, the spot where the brachial plexus compressed under the anterior scalene muscle, and applied steady downward pressure. Not painful. Controlling. The way a handler manages an animal that's bigger and stronger but still needs to be guided. His knees bent. Not dropping him. Just bringing him down gradually, his body responding to the neurological signal that resistance was futile. He sank onto the ICU floor, his face crumpling like wet tissue. Margaret lowered herself beside him, knees on the cold tile. Her hand never left his shoulder. Around them, the alarms continued their electronic screaming. The young man in bed 12 was still seizing, his monitor lights flashing in chaotic patterns. But Margaret didn't look at the machines. She looked at the man whose brother had died in this hospital, and she spoke to him in Arabic in a voice that only he could hear. Tell me his name. He told her. Yasir. 22. Shrapnel wound from a market bombing. Came to St. Michael's with a Glasgow coma scale of 6. Brain dead on arrival. The hospital kept him alive for 7 days while the family prayed for a miracle that wouldn't come. I'm going to help you understand what happened, Margaret said. But first, I need you to breathe with me. In for 4. Out for 6. Can you do that? They breathed together on the ICU floor while security arrived. The sound of boots on tile, professional, controlled, not panicked. 2 uniformed officers moving in from the side entrance, their posture cautious but not aggressive. They saw Margaret kneeling beside the man, her hand on his shoulder, speaking softly in a language that wasn't English. They stopped moving. Waited. He's going to let you help him up, Margaret said quietly, still in Arabic. These men are here to help. Not to hurt. You understand? He nodded. His body had stopped shaking. The rage had burned down to something else, grief that was sharp and real and needed no rebar to express it. Margaret looked up at the security chief. A veteran, she could tell from the way he held himself. Probably had served, probably understood what she was doing. We need a trauma counselor down here. And we need this man to have water. And we need information about his brother's case. Already requested, the chief said quietly. It took 9 minutes for the young man in bed 12's seizure to resolve. Margaret left the Iraqi man in the care of the security officers and moved to bed 12 with practiced efficiency. She ran the back of her hand across his forehead, a gesture that had nothing to do with medical assessment and everything to do with saying, "You're not alone," while she adjusted his flow rate and checked the monitor. His O2 sat climbed back to 94. His heart rate steadied. She didn't need to do an emergency medication push. The seizure had been stress response, not status epilepticus. His body had reacted to the chaos around him, that's all. The charge nurse appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he do anything to you?" "No." Margaret continued checking the young man's pupils with her penlight. "Equal and reactive. Get trauma services to call his family. Tell them he seized but he's stable now. And get me his neuroimaging films from admission. The original imaging, not the scanned copies." The charge nurse left without asking why. By the time Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office, the ICU was already returning to something resembling normal. Security had the man secured in a chair, a blanket across his shoulders. Someone had brought him water. A hospital chaplain was on the way. The machines had stopped their screaming. Margaret was documenting the young man's post-seizure status in the medical record with the same meticulous attention that had drawn Dr. Caldwell's eye just 72 hours earlier. He walked to where Margaret was typing, his posture straightened, his face arranged into the expression of a man who had just successfully managed a crisis. "Excellent de-escalation," he said, loud enough for the other nurses to hear. Though of course I was monitoring the situation from my office and gave clear directions through the communication system. Crisis management is about remaining calm and giving clear orders. That's what I did. Stayed centered. Stayed focused. He paused, waiting for the staff to nod appreciatively. A few did. Most kept their eyes on their work. The hospital will want to review this incident with security protocols in mind. I'll be overseeing that review personally. Margaret finished typing. Saved the note. Closed out of the system. She didn't turn around. Amham, she said. Neutral. Empty. Then she stood and moved to check the four in the young man's arm, her attention completely elsewhere. But Caldwell saw something in the way the other nurses looked at her now. A shift. A fracture. The respect they'd been holding in reserve, the kind they usually offered only to physicians who could write them prescriptions or improve their schedules, was now looking at the quiet woman in scrubs who'd walked toward a man with a weapon when every instinct said to run. That look would cost him more than he understood. That night, at 8:08 p.m., Dr. Caldwell made his first phone call. He was sitting in his Cadillac in the hospital parking lot, watching rain hammer against the windshield like artillery, when he dialed the hospital board chair's number. She was on a yacht in Galveston Bay, her voice carrying that particular brittleness of someone who'd had 3 martinis and didn't appreciate interruptions. Margaret Walsh violated every evacuation protocol, he said without preamble. Engaged with an armed assailant. Put the entire ICU at risk. This is a liability situation we need to address immediately. Dr. Caldwell, everyone's saying she probably saved lives down there. That's the narrative forming. We need to control it. I need your support on immediate termination. She's unstable. We need her gone before she becomes a problem. The board chair was quiet. Then, I'll have HR reach out. But there needs to be documentation. He already had it. By 11:15 p.m., Dr. Caldwell had filed a 17-page incident report characterizing Margaret's actions as reckless vigilante behavior that violated established safety protocols and endangered multiple staff members. He recommended immediate termination and suggested a potential lawsuit against her for exceeding the scope of her employment and acting without proper authorization. By midnight, he'd called Margaret's nursing school reference, a retired instructor named Dr. Patricia Brennan. "I'm asking quietly," he said, "because we need to understand if this has happened before. Has Margaret shown signs of instability? Any PTSD or aggressive tendencies that might explain this behavior?" "I don't know what behavior you're referring to," Dr. Brennan said carefully. "She engaged with an armed man. Physically subdued him. It was like watching her. Well, it was concerning." Brennan's silence stretched. "Then, Margaret was the finest student I ever taught. Steady. Compassionate. Professional. I'm sure that's what people saw," Caldwell said. "But people can have layers. Deep issues. I'm just asking as a colleague, for patient safety purposes. If you're questioning Margaret's fitness for nursing, you need to go through proper channels. Not call me at midnight." She hung up. By 6:33 a.m. Wednesday, Dr. Caldwell's third phone call had gone through to the HR investigator, a man named Sterling Voss who'd owed him a favor since Caldwell had helped him resolve a malpractice claim by steering the plaintiff's family away from the hospital toward a private settlement. Voss was tired, had been up late with his daughter's colicky newborn, and was therefore particularly receptive to a phone call that promised to be quick and simple. "She violated protocol," Caldwell said. "Engaged instead of evacuating. We have 17 pages of documentation. I'd like to move on termination by Friday." "That's aggressive timeline. She's a liability. The sooner she's gone, the sooner we're protected." Voss agreed to schedule the termination interview for Friday at 9 a.m. By Thursday evening, Caldwell had made his fourth call, the one that would matter most, to his medical billing partner at a shell company registered in Delaware. They'd been inflating procedure codes for 8 months, clearing just over $847,000 in fraudulent billing. The next target was the young man in bed 12. "Update the chart," Caldwell said. "I want a spinal tap ordered for tomorrow. Standard post-seizure protocol. Code it as $8,000 comprehensive analysis. Is it medically indicated? Does it matter?" The voice on the other end of the line was quiet. Then, "No. It doesn't. Margaret Walsh will be gone by Friday morning. The patient will be transferred to a floor where no one will check the procedure codes carefully. We get 3 more weeks of work before the next audit." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret knew exactly what he was doing. She'd been charting too carefully not to notice the pattern. The unnecessary procedures. The inflated codes. The way the hospital's billing had increased by 34% over the last 8 months while patient outcomes had stayed exactly the same. She knew. And he was firing her Friday morning specifically so she couldn't be the one who reported it. Security moved fast. 3 officers in Navy uniforms, radios crackling with static, converging on the man with practiced efficiency. The militiaman didn't resist. His rage had burned itself out somewhere between disarming and collapse, leaving only the hollow echo of grief. They cuffed him gently. Margaret noticed that the small dignity of gentleness, and a trauma counselor in a lavender blazer was already on the phone calling psychiatric evaluation, crisis de-escalation protocols, a bed at the county facility where he could tell his story without weapons in his hands. The lobby was still. 2 minutes ago it had been chaos. Now it was the kind of silence that comes after a storm passes, when the rain stops but the air still tastes like electricity. Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office. He'd locked the door at 2:36 p.m. exactly. Margaret had noted the time the way soldiers note things, automatic, precise, the part of her brain that never quite clocked out of the military. The lock clicking had sounded like a bullet chambering. Now he walked toward the nurse station with his phone already in his hand, his face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't reach his eyes. The other doctors had already scattered back to their charts and patients, the moment of danger replaced by the resumption of normal hospital machinery. The ventilators wheezed their rhythms. The monitors beeped their steady electronic prayers. Dr. Caldwell didn't look at Margaret. He went directly to the nursing director's office and closed the door. Through the window, Margaret could see him talking, animated, gesturing. His left hand kept touching his chest, the universal gesture of a man claiming innocence. Then he was looking at his phone, scrolling through something, the security footage, probably, showing it to the nursing director, whose expression shifted from confusion to concern. Margaret knew what he was doing. She'd already calculated it before she disarmed the militiaman. Before she'd knelt beside him in the aftermath of his rage and let him cry against her shoulder. She'd understood the moment Caldwell locked his office door that this was the play, let her save them all, let her be the hero for exactly 17 minutes, then reframed that heroism as recklessness that violated protocol, that endangered others, that demonstrated an unstable judgment unfit for a hospital environment. She'd walked toward a man with a weapon. In his narrative, that wasn't courage. It was a liability. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, after the militiaman was sedated and transported, after the statements had been taken from staff, after the lobby had been cleaned and the evening shift had arrived to find everything documented but unremarkable, Dr. Caldwell made for phone calls. Margaret didn't see this happen. She wouldn't learn the details until later, from a charge nurse who'd overheard billing office gossip. But she could have predicted every word. First call to Patricia Harrington, chair of the hospital board, during her dinner on the family yacht anchored off Galveston. Caldwell's voice would have been smooth, regretful, the tone of a man forced to share bad news. Patricia, I hate to interrupt your evening, but there's been an incident with one of our nurses. Potentially serious. I wanted you to hear it from me before it comes through official channels. Then he described Margaret as unstable, as having ignored evacuation protocols, as having put staff at risk through reckless engagement with a violent patient. The word unstable would be repeated 3 times. Maybe 4. Second call, to someone at her nursing school, the reference coordinator who kept files on graduates. Caldwell would have introduced himself as the ICU director at St. Michael's, his tone shifting into concerned colleague territory. I'm wondering if you ever had any concerns about Margaret Walsh's emotional stability during her training. Any incident reports? Any instructors noting erratic behavior or judgment issues? Planting seeds. Exactly the right kind of seeds, small and poisonous. Third call, somewhere else with another reference, another institution, another chance to whisper the word unstable into the record. Fourth call, to a man named David Mercer, an HR investigator who specialized in building airtight termination cases. Caldwell knew him from a previous hospital where Mercer had done work on a lawsuit Caldwell needed to survive. There was history between them. Debt. Caldwell was calling to collect. Margaret didn't know any of this yet as she finished her shift at 11 p.m. She didn't know as she drove home through Houston rain that hammered her windshield like accusations. She didn't know as she sat in her apartment with the combat boots on the table, the only physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had ever existed outside of sealed Pentagon databases and redacted files. But she suspected. Because she'd been trained to recognize patterns. To see the play 3 moves ahead. To understand that the moment she became useful, she became dangerous to a man whose entire professional existence depended on no one looking too closely at his billing codes. Friday morning, the summons came at 6:48 a.m. A text from the nursing director, come to administrator's office before shift. 7:30. The language was formal. Clinical. The kind of tone used when the decision has already been made. Margaret showered. Dressed in civilian clothes, a dark blouse, grey slacks, the kind of outfit that showed respect for the ritual of termination. She didn't wear the combat boots. Those stayed hidden in the plastic bag in her closet, along with the rest of her past. The administrator's office was on the executive level, the kind of place where the carpet was thick and the windows looked out over Houston's medical district like a kingdom. 3 people waited for her behind a mahogany desk the size of a lifeboat. The nursing director, Dr. Caldwell, who finally looked at her with an expression of professional sadness. And a 4th person, David Mercer, the HR investigator, thin and grey and wearing the kind of neutral expression that came from having built 100 termination cases exactly like this one. A manila folder sat on the desk. Closed. Waiting. "Margaret, thank you for coming in," the administrator said. The words sounded rehearsed, which meant they probably were. "We've conducted a thorough review of yesterday's incident with the patient who brought a weapon into the ICU. Yesterday." As if 17 minutes of consequence could be reduced to a single day, a single incident report filed by the man who'd locked himself away while she was moving toward danger. "Our policy is clear," the administrator continued. "In the event of a violent threat, staff are required to evacuate and allow security to handle the situation. You chose to engage the patient directly, which put yourself and others at risk." The folder opened. Photographs of the rebar. Screenshots of the security footage, showing her walking forward while others scattered backward. A witness statement from Dr. Caldwell describing her actions as reckless, as dangerous, as a deviation from protocol that could have resulted in multiple casualties. There were also references to her psychiatric history. Margaret's eyes caught on that phrase before moving past it. No psychiatric history existed. But there was a note from her nursing school reference coordinator mentioning certain concerns about emotional stability that were noted during training, which was interesting because no such concerns had ever been noted, which meant Caldwell had called with the right kind of leading question that made it sound like documentation that wasn't quite there was suddenly floating in a professional record. "Effective immediately, you're terminated for reckless endangerment of staff and patients," the administrator said. The words were clinical. Rehearsed. They sounded like something that had been approved by legal, vetted for defensibility, built specifically to prevent any lawsuit from sticking. Caldwell added his voice then, "You could have gotten people killed with your cowboy behavior. This hospital has protocols for a reason." Margaret didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that the best defense against a man like Caldwell was silence. Not the silence of fear or shame, but the silence of a woman who had already decided what this moment meant and understood that no argument would change it. She signed the separation paperwork with a pen that didn't shake. Collected her employee badge, that thin laminate rectangle that had been her only civilian credential. Listened to the administrator explain the health insurance transition, the final paycheck, the requirement to return all hospital property by end of business. The descent to the laundry room felt like a descent into something deeper than just the hospital's basement. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of bleach and hot moisture, the particular climate of machines that never stopped working. 3 folding tables. Industrial dryers humming on a rhythm that probably matched her heartbeat if she'd been paying attention. She had a laundry cart of scrubs, blue surgical wear, some with her name embroidered on the pocket. Most without. Hers to return. The rules required it. Everything that belonged to St. Michael's had to be returned, accounted for, documented. Margaret stood alone in the humid room and began folding. Her hands moved through the pattern automatically. Hospital fold, military precision, the same way she'd folded field uniforms in a barracks 17 years ago. The fabric was soft from 1,000 washings. It smelled like industrial soap and thyme. These scrubs had been her disguise. The perfect camouflage for a woman who needed to disappear from the world she'd almost died in. A nurse was invisible. Necessary but invisible. People didn't ask questions about nurses. They didn't investigate them. Caldwell had looked right through her until she'd become a liability, and then he'd looked through her again, using the administrative process to make her invisible not through dignity but through termination. She folded the last one. Each garment went into the hospital return bin. The worn combat boots, the one she'd kept hidden in the locker, the only physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had ever existed, went into a plastic bag with her personal items. Her locker had been cleared by security while she was in the termination meeting. Professional. Thorough. The escort happened on the way out. A security officer, a young man who probably felt sorry for her but couldn't show it, accompanying her through the corridors she'd walked for 3 years. They passed bed 12. The brain-damaged soldier with her name tattooed on his forearm was staring blankly at the ceiling. His fingers twitched sometimes, automatic movements with no conscious direction. He'd been diagnosed as essentially comatose, locked in, unreachable. The injury from the IED in Tikrit had burned away the parts of him that made him human. She'd saved him once. Carried him through 11 miles of hostile territory with his weight on her shoulders and blood running down her ribs from shrapnel. That night, the Pentagon had ordered her erased from every database. This morning, Caldwell had ordered her erased from the hospital. The young soldier never looked at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling tiles. They had no idea that the woman walking past his bed was losing her mind right now, in the controlled, disciplined way that former operators lost their minds, quietly, completely, with no one watching. That night, Margaret sat in her apartment with the combat boots on a kitchen table. The only proof. The only physical evidence that she'd ever been anything other than the nurse who'd been fired for recklessness. She'd left the military because she was ordered to vanish. She'd left it after something happened in Tikrit that was classified so deep that the operation itself had been erased. The Pentagon had given her 3 options: federal prosecution for unauthorized operations, suicide, or disappearing entirely. She'd chosen the third one. Now she'd disappeared twice. The boots sat there, leather-worn smooth from 18 years of use. The sole showed the pattern of her personal geology, the way her left foot wore down slightly faster than her right from an old injury. The mud of 3 different continents was ground into the stitching, colors that wouldn't wash out. She picked them up. Held them. And then her phone rang. 1 week after Dr. Caldwell's paperwork had erased her name from St. Michael's payroll, Margaret Walsh sat in the hospital waiting room handling documents that felt like death certificates. Health insurance transition forms. Retirement account rollovers. The bureaucratic equivalents of a discharged soldier gathering their uniforms and walking out the gate for the last time. Her hands moved through the papers with the same mechanical precision that had once assembled sniper rifles in desert darkness. 1 signature per line. 1 date per box. The fluorescent overhead lights buzzed their endless electric dirge, and the lobby smelled of coffee that had been brewing since before dawn, that stale, burnt undertone of a place that never truly closed. Then the windows began to shake. Rotor wash. That distinctive percussion that Margaret's body recognized before her conscious mind could process it. The sound of helicopter blades compressing air into waves of force that rattled the glass and made the water cooler in the corner hum in a frequency that only military personnel truly understood. A Black Hawk. Not a life flight medical transport, those came from the East helipad. This one was coming directly over the main entrance. Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally. Her fingers stilled on the Cobra insurance form. In her peripheral vision, security shifted. The receptionist looked up from her keyboard. The Black Hawk descended with the deliberate slowness of a predator settling, and Margaret recognized the telltale markings on the fuselage. Not Army aviation. Something else. Something that carried people with names that got redacted from official documents. The lobby doors burst open. Not the gentle swing of normal hospital traffic, the mechanical violence of security-cleared personnel moving with purpose. A stretcher appeared first, the kind that typically meant a VIP patient or a trauma case so critical that protocol gave way to necessity. Margaret's training kicked in automatically. She catalogued the details. 2 medical personnel in combat fatigues. 1 full line running. Blood visible on the left side of gauze wrapping. The patient's face was partially obscured, but the frame was recognizable: broad shoulders, the muscular weight of someone who'd spent years in physical conditioning. And then the patient's eyes opened. They locked directly with Margaret's, and in that fraction of a second, a name passed between them without words. The eyes widened, a moment of recognition that crossed the space of the waiting room like a physical force. The patient's lips moved. 1 word. Gasped. Barely audible over the ambient hospital noise. Alcibiades. Margaret's hands went still. The pen dropped to her lap. Alcibiades. The whisper. The code name that had been classified so deeply that when the government had made her disappear, they'd buried that name so thoroughly that only 5 people in the world should have known it. 5 people, all of them dead or out of the service or scattered across private security contracts in places that didn't appear on maps. The stretcher rolled past without stopping. The patient's eyes remained locked on hers for 2 more seconds before the escort team moved him toward the trauma bay, his lips moving again, soundlessly, and Margaret read them perfectly. "Chief. You made it." The waiting room had gone very quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down a corridor, a code was being called. The intercom crackled with pages that seemed to come from very far away. Then an old man in a security uniform stepped in front of her. Not hospital security, his bearing was different. His uniform was different. Retired military. His eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen things that didn't heal. "Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh," he said. "Not a question." Margaret looked up at him. Her expression remained unchanged, but her voice, when she spoke, had shifted. 3 octaves lower than it had been 1 week ago. "You served. Jock. 2008 through 2014. I knew your file before they redacted it." He extended his hand, and Margaret stood. "The Pentagon's been looking for you for 7 years. Apparently, an asset just rolled into this hospital's trauma bay with your name on his lips, and suddenly some very important people remembered where you were. Within 60 minutes, the lobby had transformed. The casual chaos of a working hospital had been overlaid with a different kind of order, the kind that came with security clearances and encrypted communications and men in dress uniforms who moved through the space with the efficiency of people who didn't need to ask for permission twice. Margaret had been moved to a private waiting area, away from the civilian lobby, away from the chaos of normal medical operations. That's where the 2-star general found her. He was smaller than she'd expected, but that was always the way with people who carried real authority. They didn't need to take up much space. His dress blues were immaculate, a uniform that looked like it had never been worn, which meant it had been pressed that morning. His rank insignia caught the overhead lights, and his eyes, when they settled on Margaret's, held the kind of assessment that came from 3 decades of reading soldiers. "Master Chief Walsh," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm Major General Simmons, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We need to talk about Dr. James Caldwell." He opened a file folder, and Margaret caught sight of her own name, her real name, her full military record, the sections that had been redacted from the civilian world appearing now in complete clarity. "But first, I need to read you something." He pulled out a single page, turned it toward the light, and began to read in a voice that carried the formal cadence of military ceremony. "Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Silver Star Citation. For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces while deployed to Tikrit, Iraq, in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. While conducting a direct action raid on a high-value target, the element came under sustained automatic weapons fire from fortified positions. Master Chief Walsh, demonstrating exceptional tactical awareness and disregard for her own safety, executed a flanking maneuver that neutralized 2 enemy machine gun nests, resulting in the rescue of 4 wounded coalition personnel. Her decisive action, combined with medical expertise, directly prevented loss of life and enabled the successful extraction of the entire element. Master Chief Walsh's actions reflect tremendous credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Armed Forces." The words hung in the air of the small waiting room. Margaret did not move. Did not blink. The trembling that came from inside her was not fear. It was restraint. 7 years of restraint. 7 years of being unmade, unrecognized, untitled. 7 years of folding hospital linens while the woman who had carried soldiers out of burning buildings was folded away into something smaller. "There's more," General Simmons said, and he gestured toward the door. They moved Margaret to the ICU. To the observation room overlooking the trauma bay where the diplomat, the former Taliban commander turned intelligence asset, lay on a surgical table, his injury being stabilized by a team of trauma surgeons. But that wasn't what stopped Margaret's breath. Bed 12. The young man with the tattooed name on his forearm was being wheeled in. The one she'd been told would never speak again. The one whose brain damage was too profound, too extensive, too devastating for recovery. His nurse was walking beside the stretcher, explaining something to General Simmons in a low voice. "Yesterday." He asked for her by name. "Chief Walsh," he kept saying. "Asked for Chief Walsh." We had no idea what he meant until we pulled his file and saw the notes. The nurse stopped, realizing what she was witnessing. The story her patient had been trying to tell them for 2 years, finally making sense. The young man's eyes tracked across the room and found Margaret. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Margaret read them perfectly, the way she'd read combat situations and tactical movements and the unspoken language of soldiers who'd learned to communicate in whispers. "You got me out." She had carried him 11 miles through Tikrit, through the burning wreckage of a Humvee, through the kind of darkness that came when the power grid failed and the enemy still had ammunition. Carried him on her back when his legs were already gone, when the IED blast had taken everything below his waist but left him alive. Alive because she had walked toward the threat instead of away from it. Alive because Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh didn't leave soldiers behind. The lobby was starting to fill. News cameras. Margaret hadn't called them, security had, because this wasn't a private story anymore. This was a public reckoning. This was accountability. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the lobby at 3:19 p.m., moving through the corridors with the casual entitlement of a man who owned the space. Margaret watched from the upper observation deck as the hospital CEO turned to face him. Her name was Patricia Reeves, and in that moment, her expression became something carved from ice. "You're fired," she said. "Effective immediately." Caldwell's face went pale. Not shock, he'd clearly known something was wrong from the sudden appearance of military personnel. But the finality of it, the public nature of it, the way that every staff member in the lobby had stopped moving to watch, that landed with the force of a physical blow. "I don't think you understand," Caldwell began, and his voice carried that particular arrogance of a man who'd never genuinely believed consequences applied to him. "I have 17 years at this facility. I've brought millions in consulting revenue." "Consulting revenue," General Simmons said, stepping forward, "that came from a series of shell companies that received payments for procedures never rendered to patients never evaluated." "Yes. We're aware." The general nodded to 2 military police officers who'd entered quietly during the exchange. Their presence transformed the lobby into something other than a hospital. "Dr. Caldwell, you're also wanted for questioning regarding Medicare fraud, inflated billing codes, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. Our Financial Crimes Unit has been investigating this facility for 6 months. Master Chief Walsh's meticulous documentation was flagged by our auditors as the only accurate records in the ICU." Margaret watched from the observation deck as Caldwell's face cycled through denial, then anger, then the specific flavor of desperation that comes when a man realizes his network of favors and threats has evaporated. Security appeared. The news cameras captured every frame as the military police moved Caldwell toward the exits. He tried to maintain composure, tried to project authority, but there was nothing left to project. The network that had protected him, the board members, the insurance companies, the HR investigator who owed him favors, all of it was disintegrating in real time. As he passed the trauma bay, Caldwell caught sight of the young man from bed 12. The soldier. The one he'd tried to use as a billing code. Their eyes met for one moment, and Caldwell saw something in that moment that destroyed whatever remained of his composure. He saw purpose. He saw a life that had survived despite his indifference. He saw the opposite of everything he'd built. By 5:23 p.m. that evening, the hospital board chair, the one who'd supported Caldwell's employment and signed off on his salary increases, was receiving phone calls from her contacts asking her to resign. The dinner companion she'd been meeting on her yacht turned out to be a medical equipment supplier who'd been paying kickbacks to Caldwell's billing scheme. The HR investigator who'd owed him favors found his own employment terminated for ethics violations within 72 hours. Hospital administration launched a full audit that would eventually reveal $2.3 million in fraudulent billing codes, with Caldwell's name attached to 89% of the inflated procedures. His medical license would be suspended pending criminal investigation. His lawyers would attempt to negotiate, but the ICE investigation had been thorough. The case was solid. Margaret was offered reinstatement with back pay, a formal public apology to be read at mandatory staff meeting, and a promotion to ICU nursing director. She accepted only the reinstatement, asking to return to bedside care. The combat boots were placed in a shadow box by the JSOC security officer, mounted on the ICU wall with a small brass plaque. The engraving took 3 days to complete, but when it was finished, the words read, M. Walsh, MCPO, some carry weapons, some carry people. She stood in front of it on her first day back, in scrubs that felt like coming home, and read the words without allowing her expression to change. Behind her, medical students and residents walked past, pausing to look up at the boots, at the name, at the rank they didn't yet understand. One of them would Google it. One of them would find redacted documents. One of them would eventually piece together the story that Margaret had lived. That was fine. What mattered was the work. What mattered was that the young soldier in physical therapy could see her walking the corridors and wave with the joy of someone who'd been given a second life. What mattered was the letter that came through his counselor 6 weeks after the reckoning, the former Iraqi militiaman, writing that he'd enrolled in community college, studying to be a paramedic, wanting to save lives instead of taking them. Wanting to be the kind of person who walked toward threats instead of away from them. One evening, a teenage girl was rushed into the ICU after a car accident, terrified and alone, her family still 40 minutes away. Margaret took her hand with the same steady grip that had once dragged soldiers through sandstorms, that had carried wounded colleagues, that had steadied surgical instruments while performing open chest compressions in the back of a moving transport. "You're safe now," Margaret said quietly. "I've got you." The girl's breathing steadied. The panic in her eyes receded slightly. Her fingers gripped Margaret's hand as the monitors began to show what Margaret already knew would happen, that this girl would make it, would walk out of this hospital, would have a life that stretched beyond this moment. Because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. And Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had finally found the mission that mattered most, not the one that had made her disappear, but the one that had brought her back. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.